This moment with Bob is entitled In These Times. Hey, Mike. I'm finding it increasingly difficult to read the news these days. It's as if the articles are written for the simple-minded, or are written by the simple-minded. Regardless, for the most part, the news is junk. Last week, I found myself at the website of Foreign Affairs magazine. Here's a cut and paste about them from Wikipedia. Quote, Foreign Affairs is an American magazine of international relations and U.S. foreign policy published by the Council on Foreign Relations, a nonprofit, nonpartisan membership organization and think tank specializing in U.S. foreign policy and international affairs. End quote, Wikipedia. And who makes up the Council on Foreign Relations? That's a conspiratorial Google for another day. Let's just say for now, these guys don't write with crayons. The article that caught my eye was entitled, What If the War in Ukraine Doesn't End? It was about how long Russia might be in Ukraine. The Council on Foreign Affairs, the CFR, was founded in 1921. And they've been around long enough, so they should know the answer to that question. But the article itself didn't give any real answers, just a bunch of blather, yak. The real answer to that question is a variation of the old joke that goes, where does an 800-pound gorilla sleep? Anywhere he wants to. Since the end of World War II, when a nuclear state invaded a non-nuclear state, the nuclear state stayed in the non-nuclear state, butchering the people for as long as it wanted to. Period. The U.S. illegally invaded Vietnam in 1964, and by the time they packed up and went home 11 years later, about 6 million Vietnamese had been killed. According to the CIA's own figures, the illegal invasion and bombing of Cambodia took another 600,000 lives. The U.S. invaded illegally Afghanistan in 2001 and left at least 250,000 dead in its wake 20 years later. The U.S. illegally invaded Iraq in 2003, with the combat mission formally concluding 18 years later. About 1 million Iraqis perished during that time. These three examples are unarguably war crimes containing within them multiple war crimes. The people that committed them are war criminals. Period. U.S. politicians from the president on down and pundits who supported America's recent war crimes are calling Russia's invasion of Ukraine a war crime and Vladimir Putin a war criminal. This is from William River Pitt's column published in the April 12, 2022, truthout.org. Quote, in the wake of so-called shock and awe, i.e. the mass bombing of a city full of civilians, and alongside Abu Ghraib, mass torture of people being held without trial by an occupying force, Fallujah was the apex of brutality by the waning U.S. empire, end quote, according to journalist Dar Jamail, who is quoted by William Rivers Pitt. And journalist Dar Jamail reported for Truthout for many years, and he told William in a recent email, quote, I know because I was there before, during, and after the siege of that city, end quote, Dar Jamail. Jamail continued, quote, the corporate press is aghast at the atrocities they're witnessing across Ukraine, and rightly so. The intentional targeting of civilians, collective punishment, bombing civilian targets like apartments and train stations and hospitals, all war crimes. Finding burned bodies with their hands tied, cluster bombs, and encircling cities and intentionally starving the people within them and cutting them off from medical help. War crimes, the corporate press, and presidents of the EU and the U.S. and other countries are right to call as such. But where was the same outrage about U.S. war crimes in Iraq? Having reported from that country off and on for a decade, I can say unequivocally that the Russians have done nothing worse in Ukraine than U.S. military did in Iraq. End quote. Dar Jamail. In Hearts and Minds, a documentary about the Vietnam War, released in 1974, the scene that has stayed with me for the last 48 years is a funeral of a South Vietnamese soldier and his devastated family. The screaming and sobbing mother had to be held back from climbing into the grave after the coffin. Cut to General William Westmoreland, commander of American military operations in Vietnam, telling the stunned filmmaker that, quote, "The Oriental doesn't put the same high price on life as does a Westerner. Life is plentiful. Life is cheap in the Orient." End quote. Last week, President Biden accused Russia of genocide. What he did not say was, we should know. The United States has committed genocide against anybody we've wanted to for nearly 250 years. Life is plentiful. Life is cheap. And hypocrisy is seemingly infinite here on planet Earth. Regards from beautiful British Columbia, Bob. Another Moment with Bob, brought to you by your friends at Offshore Drilling. And by the way, any essay written by Bob that you've heard on this podcast, you can find at his website, which is voicesinourheads.com. Okay? Okay. Now, to be clear, and I know Bob. I've known Bob for, a very long time. Although we don't have a lot of contact of late because we live in different countries. But there is not a moment's hesitation on Bob Alexander's part to condemn what the leader of Russia has done in Ukraine. The point of the criticisms that come from Bob Alexander or Mike Malloy or anybody, Noam Chomsky, Dar Jamail, whoever it is, who find the outrage just a bit hypocritical, does not in any way diminish the horror that we all feel about what is being done to the Ukrainian people. Putin is a violent son of a bitch. But how many leaders of the United States have been violent son of a bitches insofar as they demonstrated that violence by attacking countries that had done nothing to us? You know, we have to remember, whether we like this or not, and it has caused me some confusion over the years, but the Korean War in 1950 was an attempt by the so-called North Koreans to unite their country after being occupied by the Chinese, by the Japanese, and they were trying to unite their country, and they were going to do it under the political/economic system of communism. And because of the Truman Doctrine that was established by President Harry Truman that said, we will contain communism where it is at the end of World War II, because of that, we sent 40,000 Americans to their deaths and totally, completely, with no mercy and no equivocation, destroyed Korea above the 38th parallel, utterly. And if you're not aware of that conflict, you should just read up on it a little bit, because we targeted everything in North Korea, everything. Schools, hospitals, bridges, water supplies, power grids, dams, everything. And now we get freaked out, and I certainly do too, about the madness of Kim Jong-un and the Kim family. His grandfather was the one who established, so-called, the idea of an independent Korea united above and below the 38th parallel. So as far as Korea was concerned, and I've mentioned this before, the United States and our allies, we dropped more tonnage of bombs on North Korea than we dropped during the entire Second World War, including the nuclear weapons we dropped on Japan. Now, when you stop and consider that, I fully understand the paranoia of this, admittedly, in my opinion anyway, crazy guy who runs the grandson of the original Kim Il-sung, or whatever his name was, the original founder of Korea, North Korea. I fully recognize that he's nuts, but who made him nuts is kind of my point. Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh had been an ally of the United States in fighting Japanese occupation during World War II in the Pacific. Yeah, we were allies. And this was after during the time when the French considered Vietnam to be part of their colonial empire, and after World War II, when colonialism was falling apart and breaking up around the globe. Ho Chi Minh wanted to have an independent country. He had been occupied by the French, by the Chinese, by the Japanese. But he too had the idea of communism. Probably not as crazy as the Kim family in Korea, but it was still communism. And Ho Chi Minh had been educated all over in Europe, right? I don't think he'd been in the United States. I may be wrong on that. But what did we do? We went to Vietnam. We destroyed that country. People there are still getting sick and dying way before their times because of what we did with Agent Orange. What we did with chemical warfare. Now, yes, Putin is a filthy, murderous bastard for what he did in Syria with chemical warfare. And he's threatening to do it in Ukraine. Chemical warfare. But if we're honest with ourselves, which we are not, we recognize that we have done that also. And when you consider napalm, jellied gasoline, I mean, how do we label Vladimir Putin a war criminal and not label George W. Bush a war criminal? I mean, how do you do that? Well, a very simple answer. You do it because you hide behind a wall, or one hides behind a wall of utter, complete hypocrisy. And again, this is in what I'm saying, what Bob Alexander said, what so many people have said about this. This is not to pardon what Vladimir Putin is doing. He is a filthy, murderous son of a bitch, but he is doing nothing different from what we've done. So what do we do about that? Hi, Truth Seekers. Mike Malloy here. As you know, we've switched formats and are now broadcast exclusively on the Progressive Voices Network. So that means you get fewer program interruptions, no corporate commercials, and lots of profanity. But our format change also means some of our radio listeners no longer hear the program. It's been a while since I mentioned our podcasts, so you may have forgotten that there is a way to listen to this program anytime you need a good dose of screaming. Visit MikeMalloy.com and subscribe to our podcast. As a podcast subscriber, you can download the program to your mobile device and take me with you wherever you go. And if you have a friend who needs a dose of truth-seeking, you can give a gift subscription as well. That's MikeMalloy.com, and never miss a minute of the uncensored fun and frivolity.